I'm very happy to welcome to this symposium Professor Amartya Sen, Nobel Prize winner in economics and Lamont University Professor of Economics and Philosophy at Harvard University. Professor Sen is also a long-standing student and scholar of Kerala's development experience. Welcome to this symposium, Amartya, and thanks very much for being with us. Amartya, what have the pandemic and lockdown taught us about the importance of public action in economic development?
Well, the lockdown in India as a whole, of course, had features that were very doubtful and unattractive. It wasn't done. It was done on a war footing, as if the prime minister was Napoleon rather than a leader of a public movement. And it's very important for any initiative, whether it's lockdown or not, which is connected with the COVID-19 or any other epidemic like that, to have it in consultation with the people, with the civil society, with the different political parties, with the unions, and so on. Instead of that, we had a unilateral lockdown with a 4-hour notice, stopping suddenly people from going back home and people suddenly not having the means of earning an income for people who have to live in terms of a day to mouth to food arrangement on a daily basis. This was a disastrous arrangement. Now, this, of course, is not something that was led by Kerala, or for that matter, was very much the thing that the Kerala state wanted. I think what the Kerala state wanted, as far as I can see from outside, is that they would try to exclude people from having contact with each other by testing quite widely, by tracing contact of anyone who is found to be positive or suspicion of being positive, and then seclude them and also observe them and prevent them from infecting others. Now, that actually does make a lot of medical sense, and it was very successful. So I think the first thing to recognize that if you take a part of the world, whether it's a part of a country, as in the case of Kerala, or a country itself, like India as a whole, what you have to look at is the lessons that medical understanding presents, along with the economic understanding that if you live on day-to-day wages, you can't stop earning opportunity of that income. And if you could, but then you'll be starving people to death. And that was exactly what the general situation in India happened. Watching from there, it was clear that certain things are being right, namely an attempt to seclude people from each other, testing, contact tracing, and further pursuit of separating out people. And some things were not. And the things that were not interest anyone who is an economist or any other human being about how would people earn an income and how would they live on it. And if they're far from home and they're excluded, then how would they go back home? Many of them didn't have a home to go to at that time. Their home was 1,000 miles away in Bihar and eastern UP and then Jharkhand and so on. And so there was a kind of failure to understand what was going on at the all India level. But happily, in the case of Kerala, there was a much better understanding, partly because of the long tradition of not just healthcare but also education in Kerala, made it possible to take the path of knowledge, as it were. It will distinguish between path of knowledge, path of work, and path of devotion. But path of work has to be guided by path of knowledge. And in this case, I think Kerala has reason to be proud of the fact that they took the right steps very early. And indeed, even though there was a lot of people coming into Kerala with infections, it was possible to deal with it. So there's credit there that must be given.
In what ways would you say that Kerala has benefited from a long history of public action?
Well, and state and the people, really. There have been a kind of systematic undermining of the welfare state for a number of years in Europe. I mean, Europe was, after all, the real pioneer in having the welfare state. And even though the welfare state has many limitations, it was an understanding that had sunk into Europe quite a bit. Britain played a leading part in it. The fact that the war cabinet included people like Anna and Bevan meant that during the 1940s, Britain was trying to arrange in a way that, despite the diminution of food per capita availability, that no one goes hungry. And in fact, as a result, during the 1940s and the war, the British had a lower level of undernourishment than ever in its history. And in cases of extreme undernourishment, entirely disappeared. And similarly, the healthcare that came in by 1948, when Anna and Bevan was opening the hospital in Manchester. That was the first National Health Service hospital. This was heralding a different way of thinking about relation between people and the state. And that was really quite successful, and people don't recognize how successful Europe was in that period, in the 50s and 60s, and even the beginning of 70s. One also forget that this was the time when the public debt, ratio of public debt to national income, was extraordinarily high. It was more than 300% at the time when the hospital in Manchester was being opened. At the time when Macmillan was saying, "You've never had it so good." The ratio of public debt to national income was more than 150, the 1.50. And despite that, because of the confidence that, it's very stupid to think of public debt like a private debt, because it's a debt that's owed to yourself. It's not owed to others necessarily, and mostly not in these cases. So there was all this pretty good understanding, and 50s and 60s and 70s saw a transition of Europe after the war that was totally remarkable. That included war-destroyed economies like Germany and Holland, part of France, and so on. And this was going on, but at the same time, there was a strong voice coming in without very much public reasoning behind it, indicating that the public debt is too much, we cannot bear it, and so on. when Gordon Brown was being accused of making the country unviable, the ratio of public debt to national income was 70%, as opposed to 300% when the National Health Service started and the welfare state began. So something went wrong in economic reasoning, and I think it was quite remarkable how badly wrong it went. And soon the dominant rhetoric was we have too much public debt, too much state, we have to get out of it. And everything that happened fed to it. If you take the 2008 crisis, it's a crisis of capitalism. It was it's a crisis of a kind that Adam Smith discussed in his book, dealing with the South Sea bubbles, that overconfident and over borrowing at high interest rate. This is the context in which Adam Smith supports usury laws, that you have to put a kind of upper limit to interest rate. And when all that was going on, um, uh, what happened is state found itself running a sinking economy. So the state borrowed a lot of money and bailed out private businesses. And suddenly, what was in fact a crisis of capitalism looked like a crisis of socialism, because now the state had a lot of debt in order to bail out the private enterprises. But the general reading, whether it's in France or Italy, or the European Central Bank, or then imposed on Greece and Portugal, was a completely different story. So that's the state in which it appeared. And when countries like Italy first got the COVID-19 pandemic, it was dealing with a situation when the state intervention had been severely undermined by the rhetoric, the wrong rhetoric that had been going on. And that rhetoric cost a lot of initiative time, and the Italian eventually recognized that what it needed was more state action. Happily, Kerala did not suffer from that delusion to start with either.
In what ways would you say that Kerala has benefited from a long history of public action?
Yes, in the sense that the history of public action made a certainly different, and the fact that I think you discussed that, Ram, that in the collection that Law and I did, Andres and I did, that the fact that the anti-untouchability movement moved in the direction of expanding education for all, and that was in some sense the prime mover. One of my friends and teachers, Dr. Majumdar, always used to argue that we underestimate the central role of public education in Kerala's history, because everything else, healthcare and so on, all happened later. The public education is the flag bearer in that movement. And so there was this long history, and then happily, because of the way the politics went, with the 1957 victory of the Communist Party, followed by, from the early 60s, an attempt to have universal education, universal healthcare, and so on. And somehow the Kerala population has come to accept it. Even the Congress Party, which alternated with the Communist Party, they had come to accept that culture of trusting public enterprises, public economy. That didn't happen in Europe. Europe began in much the same way. When the 1948 National Health Service was being established, the argument for public health care was very strong. The argument for a welfare state was very strong. But gradually, given the politics of Europe, that weakened. And it's quite interesting because one of the states which was involved in weakening it, Germany, had an old history. Germany had talked about public intervention for a long time. Even Bismarck talked about it. But Germany went in for much more massive public intervention and public health care and public social security than other states. On the other hand, in its role as a dominant power of the European Central Bank, it wanted Greece and Portugal to cut down on public health care, which Germany itself was doing in a much bigger way, as anyone who looks at the numbers would have seen. So there was a certain amount of intellectual confusion in Europe at that time. And by that time, the heyday of the Labour Party had moved, and Mrs. Thatcher, bolstered by the Falkland War, which turned an anti-Tory British population pro-Tory. But whatever the history of that is, there was a kind of weakening of the understanding that public enterprise and public intervention was really important for a state. An understanding that stretches back all the way to Adam Smith and the Wealth of Nations. And somehow that was really gone. And of course, in America, it had never taken root anyway. And so if we had more time, we could talk about the intellectual confusion that generated the so-called European crisis. And the European Central Bank became a handmaiden in propagating confused thinking on the subject. It's very peculiar because Mr. Trichet, who was then in charge of the European Central Bank, is an old friend of mine. I greatly like him, and I think he's a very civilized, very great man in many ways. But he was leading the movement for austerity, which is not what Europe needed at all. And it ended up having a climate of austerity, which was not only weakening for Europe at that time, but it was also made Europe's reaction to the pandemic much more hesitant and slow because they were a bit confused on this subject.
A very important component of public action in Kerala has been what you have termed acts of civic cooperation.
And it's very important, particularly dealing with things like the pandemic, because an anti-pandemic action requires not only a clear thinking state, which takes clear thinking policy initiatives, but it also requires an understanding on the part of the population as to what is being done and why. Now, if you don't have that understanding, if you're in a state where the public doesn't know why you're doing that, your initiatives are weak. And this applies not only to Kerala, it also applies to Vietnam and partly because of a similar political background. But it also applies to Thailand, even though it is not a similar background. But nevertheless, there was this big emphasis on public education, including public health education. And they hold every year a kind of public forum on discussion on healthcare, a couple of which I have attended myself. And so I think the initiatives from the bottom are required for two different reasons. One, the cooperation that is central to economic development in general. We haven't discussed that yet, but also to public health care and dealing with crises like pandemic. And second, in the absence of public support, you will not be able to sustain an understanding of the role of the state. And that's what, in some ways, happened in Europe. Increasingly, the socialist parties weakened in Europe. And instead of that, you had a much more either rather right-wing parties or rather nationalist, um, um, anti-immigrant parties. And as a result of that, you could not sustain the role that the state has to play. So you need participation from the bottom because that's the way to sustain the role of the state, even though it's coming from the bottom, because after all, these are democracies and there are elections. And secondly, you need it for the cooperative action that makes development possible and anti-pandemic, anti-crisis action effective.
Do speak also of your views on Kerala or the importance of Kerala seizing opportunities for economic growth in the contemporary world.
Yeah, I mean, that has happened because of the ability to earn an income.
Yeah.
I'm sometimes described as being strongly influenced by Marx, which is Karl Marx, which is certainly true. But I'm also very strongly influenced by Adam Smith. And one of the things Adam Smith discusses is that the main source of expansion of the wealth of nation has to be the ability of individuals to develop their skill either through division of labor or through education and improvement of the quality of labor. And when that happens, then you can expand quite rapidly. Kerala had an almost Smithian experience of that in that period. And, when after the 1957 election, when Kerala first started the public intervention in health, education, and in other areas, I remember having debate. I was then at the teaching in the early 60s in Delhi School of Economics. And there was, I was always being told, Kerala is the third poorest state in India. How could it afford to pay everyone's education and healthcare? This, of course, was an economic mistake. And secondly, it depends on how you do your budgeting. So gradually, it was a delight to me to see Kerala rising from being third lowest to gradually becoming the highest in per capita expenditure term, and it comes quite close to per capita income as well.
Amartya, what would you say COVID-19 has taught us about inequality in the world?
I think that's a very hard question, because the pandemic in itself doesn't come with lessons. It kills indiscriminately. We often see in the New York Times the banality repeated again and again, saying the COVID-19 doesn't respect class or color, that is black or white. Of course, it doesn't, and we didn't expect it. What makes that relevant is how the population reacts to it. What happened if you, and this doesn't, it applies not only to pandemic, it applies to any crisis. So when in the 1940s, early 1940s, the British discovered that they didn't have as much food per capita as they had before, what they did was to try to ensure that through rationing and control prices, that everyone will have that. And suddenly, what was a negative situation of food shortage turned into a positive situation of people having more food entitlement for those who were at the bottom of the ladder. and suddenly undernourishment disappeared. And that experience is was applauded, understood, and there were great authors like R.G. Hammond, like Titmuss, who brought those lessons to the attention of the public to learn from it. Now, unfortunately, that didn't happen. For example, take the United States, in an area like Chicago, the blacks, the African Americans, maybe 30% of the population, but 70% of the deaths were from the community of blacks, from the African American.
You mean in COVID?
From COVID. And then as a result, one has to say that there was no attempt of the egalitarian direction in which, for example, the British went in the 40s. The British experience is very interesting because the same period in which the Brits were suddenly being better fed than ever before is also the period in which the Bengal famine happened in India. And the British had no sympathy at all. Those who didn't have the means of buying food and were perishing in large way. In some ways, the perishing began in the 1942, before the famine, and then became bigger and bigger through the 43 until past October. So that you see two different attitudes of the same leadership like Churchill and Anna and Bevan. Anna and Bevan was dominant as far as Britain is concerned, but Churchill was dominant as far as India is concerned. I don't take the view, as some people do, that the famine is all the fault of one person, that underestimate what imperialism does. Imperialism it manifests itself in many forms, and one of them is a utter lack of sympathy to another group of conquered people, as opposed to the dominant metropolitan population. So that happened at that time. And in some ways, America had the feature of looking a bit like an imperial country. The slaves may have been brought to America hundreds of years earlier, and yet that distinction between we and they remains. It may be at long last receiving some real resistance in public action connected with what's going on in America right now. And I see some hope in that. What we do and how we understand the problem makes a big difference. Every adversity, every dialectical challenge is potentially a learning experience. But it need not go that way if people refuse to learn.
Is it correct to speak of a post-COVID world? Does the pandemic represent a transformatory moment?
Well, I think it could be in Kerala, because Kerala already knew a lot, but it to some extent consolidated some aspects of it, which were, in danger of being deluged under the rather deceptive uh, economic slogan that's so dominant in India today. And it provides resistance to that. But it also suggests that combating bureaucracy, combating red tape, and doing things with exceeding speed, which indeed what Kerala seemed to have done in dealing with COVID, is really very important. It's not only important for dealing with COVID-19, it's also important for making economic development get going at a high speed.
What are the points of light here? From what do we derive hope for the future?
Let's take what's going on in America. These are 8 days, 9 days now
Yeah.
had been rebellion going on. And to the extent that you read this as a revolt against inequality, in particular the inequality between blacks and whites, but not just that, but
Yeah.
beyond that, then you could say that something is being learned,
Yeah.
and learning there is a contribution of the crisis of the pandemic too. If you take that view, that's a very positive view, as opposed to one where you take the view that people are just very unhappy because things have worked out badly. And that's, there's a lesson there, but it's not as clear a lesson as it would be if it's seen as a reaction to inequality. We have to see which way it goes. At the moment, there's some real sign of dialectical hope there.
Thank you for your time. It was terrific talking to you, as always, Amartya. Thanks again.
Thank you. Talk with you.